The winter of 1954 hung over New York like a ghost that refused to leave. The city wore its cold like a heavy coat, grey sky, pale breath on every street corner, slush gathering in gutters like forgotten memories. Neon signs flickered to life in the early dusk, spilling fractured colours across wet pavement. Snow drifted in thin, restless sheets, forever searching for a place to land. Marilyn Monroe stepped out of the theatre rehearsal hall and into that winter haze, her figure soft against the hard geometry of the city. She wrapped an oversized wool coat around herself, clutched it tightly at the collar, and lowered her head against the slicing wind. Her footsteps fell lightly on the slick concrete, each step stirring faint echoes between the brick walls of the narrow alley. Moments earlier, applause inside the rehearsal space had chased her like a wave, admiration, expectancy, a dozen pairs of eyes drawn to her as if she carried her own constellation. But out here, the applause melted into the distant hum of traffic. Out here, she could breathe. This walk, just after rehearsal and just before night fully settled, was her hidden ritual. It was the hour when Marilyn became almost invisible. It was the hour she gave back to Norma Jean. Street lamps hummed overhead as she made her way toward the alley exit. Only a few fans had lingered near the front doors. She had smiled, waved, kept moving, promising herself that anonymity waited just around the corner. But in the alley's threshold, where the dim light dissolved into soft snow, someone else stood motionless. He leaned against a wall darkened by old water stains. His clothing was worn almost to threads, an oversized military coat, a frayed wool hat pulled low, boots scuffed until the leather had surrendered. Snow gathered on his shoulders like dust on an abandoned statue. His face was gaunt, eyes fixed downward, and where his right arm should have been was only a neatly sewn sleeve, pinned and empty. He held a small cardboard sign, edges curling from damp weather. The words, written in careful block letters, were simple and pleading. Korean War veteran, hungry, trying to get home. The sign shook slightly in his trembling hand. Marilyn slowed. She felt the cold in her breath, but a different chill threaded up her spine, an instinctive ache for another person suffering. She paused several paces away, studying him quietly, unseen behind her own shadowed hood. The city moved around them as if they were frozen in place. A taxi splashed through a puddle, distant sirens wailed somewhere on 7th Avenue, steam rose from a vent in a wavering column. But here, in this small pocket of stillness, time seemed to fold into something intimate, fragile. The man didn't look up. He didn't adjust his sign for better visibility. He simply stood there, as if he expected nothing and asked for nothing beyond the piece of cardboard in his hand. A gust of wind lifted the corner of his sign and tore it loose. It fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird. He made a small, defeated motion to retrieve it, but before he could bend, Marilyn stepped forward and picked it up. As she straightened and handed it back to him, he finally looked up. Recognition struck him like a physical jolt. His eyes widened in disbelief. Marilyn Monroe, an icon to millions, a face that lived on posters, billboards and screens, stood before him in an alley, hair catching the orange glow of a nearby street lamp. But it wasn't the famous smile he saw. It was something else, something quieter. She didn't beam with star-bright radiance. Her expression was gentle, solemn, concerned. She met his stunned gaze without a hint of judgment or pity, not for the missing arm, not for the worn clothes, not for the cold exhaustion lining his face. The veteran straightened, embarrassed. He tried to stand taller to appear less broken, pulling himself into the fragments of dignity he had left, but the weight of his fatigue betrayed him. Marilyn didn't look away. In that moment, she understood what his expression fought to hide. She understood the way people passed him as though he blended into brick and winter fog. She understood the invisible shadow he carried home from the war, a shadow people preferred not to see. She held the sign for a few seconds longer, brushing snow off the cardboard, then returned it gently into his grasp. The paper trembled again in his unsteady fingers. For a long breath, she simply stayed with him, the cold curling around them in shared silence. Then she stepped back and motioned toward the street, not with command but with invitation. She gestured toward the distant glow of a 24-hour diner at the block's end. The veteran hesitated, pride wavered in his eyes, shame lingered there too, thin but sharp. But Marilyn waited with patience, her posture soft and open, offering him not charity but company. Finally he nodded once, timid and grateful. They walked together through falling snow, slowly, quietly, the city stretching around them like a cavern of lights and distant engines. She matched her stride to his, careful not to outpace him. At the diner door, she held it open, letting warm air roll out over their frozen clothes. Inside, they slid into a small corner booth number 3. The veteran sat stiffly, still unsure of what was happening, still overwhelmed by the unreality of being seen, truly seen, by someone whose face the world could not look away from. But Marilyn didn't treat him as a spectacle. She folded her coat beside her, settled into her seat, and offered him a calm, almost maternal presence. The noise of the diner, clinking plates, murmured conversations, the hiss of frying bacon, formed a protective soundscape around them. As he began to talk, slowly at first, the weight of his months on the streets spilled between them. Not in dialogue, not in complete stories, but in glimpses, small observations Marilyn pieced together with quiet intuition. He had been a medic in the Korean War. He had returned with one arm and a long list of untreated injuries. He had come home to a system too overburdened to help him. He had drifted through cities searching for work, for support, for something more than sympathetic glances from strangers who kept walking. She listened without interruption, without fanfare, without attempting to fix every broken part of him in a single night. She listened like someone who understood what it felt like to be overlooked, to be adored and unseen at the same time. She listened the way she wished someone had listened to her when she was younger, lost and invisible in foster homes. In that small diner booth, she shed the shimmering skin of stardom. She let her humanity speak for her. And for the first time since the war had taken his arm and his confidence, the veteran met someone who did not look at him with pity or discomfort. The snow outside thickened, softening the edges of the city. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The diner slowly emptied, leaving only the hum of the lights above them. When he rose to leave, unsure of how to thank her, Marilyn simply placed her hand lightly atop his and gave the briefest, warmest nod, as if to say that gratitude wasn't necessary, as if his presence alone was worth her time. He left the diner with a little more warmth in his step, a little more strength in his remaining arm, and a little more hope than he'd carried in months. Marilyn watched him go, her breath slowly returning to its natural rhythm. Then she stepped back into the winter night, letting the door close softly behind her. It was the first night she met Daniel Ward. It would not be the last. Snow continued to blanket the city in pale silence during the weeks that followed, settling into the rooftops and stairwells like a patient observer. Winter deepened, and with it came the rhythm that Marilyn Monroe quietly carved into her days, a rhythm the world would never know about, a private cadence carried in the hollow between fame and solitude. She continued her routine at the rehearsal hall, continued smiling for producers, continued posing under relentless lights, continued being Marilyn for everyone who needed her to be a star. But when the cameras clicked off and her obligations dissolved into night, she slipped into her coat and vanished into New York's cold, winding streets. Not to parties, not to premieres, not to any glittering invitation she could have accepted. She went to the diner. Booth number 3. Daniel Ward always arrived early, as though scared the fragile ritual might disappear if he were late. He sat waiting with a posture that had grown a little straighter each time Marilyn saw him. His eyes no longer darted around with that lost downward panic. The weight on his shoulders remained, but something inside him had shifted, something cautiously upright, like a sapling stepping out of winter's shadow. He didn't smile often, but when he saw her enter the diner each night, the corners of his mouth lifted just barely, as if he were greeting not a movie star, but the first kindness he had experienced in far too long. Marilyn always approached with a quiet nod, her presence as gentle as snowfall collecting beneath street lamps. She never made a show of her visits. She never let her fame seep into the corners of their meetings. She simply slid into the booth and gave Daniel her full attention. And she listened. She listened to the fragmented stories of battlefield nights, of men he could not save, of the silence that followed him home like a shadow he couldn't shake. She listened to his fears of never being whole again, of becoming a burden instead of a person, of being forgotten by the country he had risked his life for. She listened the way someone listens who has spent years yearning for her own voice to be heard. She didn't fill the spaces with empty comfort, she filled them with presence. Gradually, Daniel offered more pieces of himself, hesitant but grateful. His voice rarely rose above the hum of the diner, but the sincerity in it replaced the tremble it once held. He began to share softer memories too, his love of painting before the war, the studio his father built for him in their small Midwest home, the dreams he had once nurtured with bright, unguarded hope. Marilyn held onto these details like precious stones, and she began to act on them. Not dramatically, not conspicuously, not in any way that would bruise his pride. She started by quietly covering the cost of their meals. It took only one conversation with the diner owner, and from then on, every bill Daniel attempted to settle was waved away with a shrug. "Taken care of," the owner would say. But Daniel didn't know it was Marilyn who slipped money into the hands of the staff each time she left, never once allowing her name to be connected to his dignity. Her second act of kindness came 2 weeks later. She called a doctor who treated actors injured on set. A kind man, discreet, professional. She explained, careful, vague, about a veteran who needed medical care he couldn't afford. She didn't offer details. She didn't even use Daniel's name. She simply arranged an appointment under an alias, paid in full, and ensured that the clinic contacted the diner owner at the right time. When Daniel received a message that someone had gifted him a free medical examination, he searched for the identity of the benefactor with desperate gratitude. He never found it. Marilyn overheard him asking the diner owner one night. She only looked down at her cup, her face steady, serene. Her anonymity mattered to her more than his thanks. She didn't want him to feel indebted. She didn't want her fame to overshadow his struggle. She wanted to give quietly, the way she had once wished someone had given to her. And so her third act of kindness was the most delicate of all. It happened on a night when she arrived to find him shivering in his coat, thinner than she remembered, with deep circles under his eyes. The winter had been cruel. His body had endured too much cold. Without letting him know, she bought him a room at a modest boarding house nearby, a place clean, warm, safe. She slipped the payment into the manager's hand and instructed him to treat Daniel as a regular tenant. No charity attached, no special treatment. Later that night, back at the diner, as Daniel finished his meal, the manager appeared, offering him a key attached to a worn leather fob. Daniel stared at the key in confusion. "A room, been prepaid for you for a month," the manager explained. Daniel tried to refuse, insisting he had no money for such a thing. "Already taken care of," the man replied. Daniel's bewilderment lingered for days. Marilyn saw it in his expression, the way he seemed to suddenly walk with a hint of purpose, as though someone had quietly placed a hand on his back and nudged him toward hope. Her fourth act came when she noticed the way his eyes lit up whenever he mentioned painting. There was longing there, subtle, buried, but unmistakable. So she visited an art supply store on 8th Avenue, wearing sunglasses and a scarf pulled tightly around her hair. She walked through the aisles with thoughtful care, selecting items one by one: brushes of varying thickness, a palette knife, tubes of oil paint in deep blues and burnt umbers, a set of charcoal pencils, and a sketchbook bound in black leather. She asked the cashier to wrap the items and deliver them to the diner for a man named Daniel. She instructed that the sender remain anonymous. When Daniel received the package 3 days later, Marilyn was already seated in the booth sipping tea. She watched his reaction through lowered lashes, pretending to focus on stirring her cup. His hands shook, not with cold but with something deeper, something fragile and uplifting. Inside the folded note, written in simple, careful handwriting, were the only words she allowed herself to give. "For Daniel, from a friend who believes in second chances." He read it twice, then a third time. Marilyn kept her gaze on her tea, but in the reflection on the window beside her, she caught the faintest glimmer of renewed life in his expression. His shoulders straightened. His eyes filled not with grief but with possibility. Something inside him had rekindled. From that day on, he carried the sketchbook wherever he went. Sometimes he sat in the diner for hours, sketching patrons, shadows, cups, napkin dispensers, capturing the world around him with the ease of someone remembering how to breathe. And Marilyn kept coming each evening, her schedule shrinking around these meetings like a protective shell. The producers believed she was exhausted. Her agent thought she was going through a phase of solitude. The public saw nothing unusual. Only Marilyn knew the truth. This was the hour she felt the most at peace. This was where she felt most human. And as winter leaned towards spring, their nightly ritual became more than routine. It became a sanctuary. For him and for her. But the world around Marilyn never stopped moving. Studios called, roles demanded her presence, obligations pressed in like tightening walls. Soon a message arrived from Hollywood, filming dates, schedules, contracts. She felt the city shift beneath her feet, the inevitability of departure looming like a quiet storm. Marilyn would not be in New York much longer. And though she kept her face calm, her heart tightened with the knowledge that the routine she cherished, the booth, the snow, the quiet companionship, was nearing its final hour. The last meeting with Daniel approached like the slow closing of a door neither of them wanted to hear. Spring crept into New York with hesitant warmth, melting the snow into thin silver rivulets that traced the sidewalks like delicate veins. The city emerged from winter's grip slowly, each streetlight shedding its frost, each storefront revealing its colors again. But for Marilyn, the change in season brought neither relief nor joy. It brought departure. The studio had finalized her schedule. Filming in Los Angeles would begin soon, and every day leading up to that date pressed in around her like a tightening frame. She knew she had only one more night at the diner, one more night at booth number 3, one more night to sit across from Daniel Ward and pretend that their world did not exist in the fragile space between two vastly different lives. The evening before her departure, Marilyn walked to the diner with a heaviness she tried to hide beneath the steady rhythm of her footsteps. The lights inside glowed warmly through the windows, softened by the faint mist still lingering in the air. She paused outside for a moment, collecting herself, as though preparing to enter a memory she already feared losing. Inside, Daniel sat in his usual place. The sketchbook lay on the table in front of him, its pages worn slightly at the edges. His posture was stronger now, more certain, his presence grounded by newfound purpose. He looked up when she entered, his expression easing into the quiet, shy warmth she'd grown accustomed to. Marilyn slipped into the booth with her familiar grace, folding her coat beside her. She kept her breathing calm, though an ache pressed beneath her ribs, a subtle panic at the thought of stepping away from this tiny world she had built with him. She knew he didn't see what he had become in these past weeks. He didn't see the spark returning to his eyes. He didn't notice the way he carried himself with more dignity now, the way his sketches had deepened in confidence, the way he had begun to reclaim his identity piece by piece. But she saw it. She had seen it every night. And leaving it behind felt like leaving behind a part of her own heartbeat. They spent hours in the booth, but they felt like minutes. Their time together existed in gestures, in the subtle shifts of emotion, in the shared silence that had become their language. Daniel showed her a few of his sketches, carefully, almost reverently, as though he feared the drawings might dissolve under her gaze. She admired them with genuine awe, the quiet pride he carried warming her more deeply than any applause she'd ever received on a stage. And then, as the hours ticked by, the reality settled between them like a dimming light. Marilyn's departure couldn't be delayed. This would be their last meeting. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She held it for several seconds, hesitant, her thumb brushing its edge the way one touches something too delicate to rush. This was her final act of kindness, her last offering. The one gift she wanted him to keep when everything else faded. She placed the folded paper on the table and slid it toward him, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just quietly the way she had offered everything else. Daniel looked at it, confused, uncertain. She met his gaze and gave the smallest nod, urging him to open it. Inside the folded slip of paper was a single sentence, written in her soft looping handwriting, the ink pressed into the page with gentle conviction. "You matter in this world, please don't forget that." His breath caught, not just in surprise, but in recognition, as though someone had reached into the coldest corner of his life and lit a candle there. He looked up, searching her face for an explanation, for a reason she would write such a thing. But Marilyn only offered that delicate, almost heartbreaking smile, the kind born from a well of compassion deeper than anyone believed she possessed. She stood then slowly, letting the moment settle like dust in warm lamplight. She placed a single hand on the table, steadying herself against the inevitable. It was time. Daniel rose as well, clutching the note as if it were fragile enough to crumble but precious enough to protect with his life. He didn't know how to express the weight of what she had done for him, not just tonight, but for every night she had chosen to sit across from him and treat him like a man worth knowing. But Marilyn didn't need words. She saw everything in his eyes, the gratitude, the sorrow, the fear of losing the only person who had made him feel seen since returning home. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering comfort without expectation. Then she stepped away, her coat gathered around her as she headed toward the door. The diner lights cast a soft halo around her figure, making her appear almost ethereal, like stardust drifting through a quiet room. At the door, she turned back for one last glance. He stood there in the booth where their small sanctuary had lived, holding the note, holding onto the final thread of a connection that had reshaped his life. She gave him one last soft, luminous smile. And then she was gone. Marilyn left New York the next morning as the city exhaled into the pale dawn. The train carried her westward, windows rattling softly, the landscape blurring into streaks of brown and grey. She pressed her forehead against the glass and watched the miles stretch between her and everything she had tried to nurture in the quiet corners of a diner. She didn't look back, but she carried the memory of Daniel with her, folded gently inside her heart like her own private talisman. The world outside saw her move on to new roles, new photographs, new headlines. She became 1,000 new versions of Marilyn Monroe, each one crafted for a different spotlight. But in the spaces no camera ever witnessed, she remembered him, the veteran who reminded her of the value of small miracles, the man who'd shown her that even in the vast loneliness of fame, she could still choose to be human. Time passed swiftly, indifferent to the lives it carried in its wake. Daniel rebuilt himself slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone relearning how to live. His medical treatment eased his chronic pain. His new housing gave him stability. The art supplies unlocked a part of him he thought had been buried on a battlefield overseas. He began to paint seriously, portraits, cityscapes, swirling colours that mirrored the emotions he had long suppressed. His talent revived itself like a flame catching dry tinder, burning brighter with each sketch, each canvas, each stroke of a brush. He found work assisting at a small gallery. He made friends. He even fell in love. But in all the years that followed, he told only one person the truth, the woman he eventually married. He told her about the night a stranger with a warm smile and a soft voice reached into his despair and pulled him toward the light again. He never embellished it, never used her fame to impress anyone, never once uttered her name to the world. That woman saved my life, he told his wife. But he never revealed who she was. Not even after the world mourned Marilyn Monroe. Decades later, long after his hair had turned silver and his hands had grown unsteady with age, Daniel kept a small framed item on the wall of his studio apartment. It hung beside his paintings, illuminated each morning by sunlight that poured through the curtain gaps. It was not a photograph, not a sketch, not a souvenir from the diner. It was her note. "You matter in this world, please don't forget that." The sentence had faded slightly over the years, the paper yellowed at the edges, but the words remained as steady and life-giving as the day she wrote them. Daniel often paused in front of it, letting the memory wash over him, not with sadness but with gratitude, the kind of gratitude that reshapes a life from the inside out. He never forgot her. He never forgot what she had done. He never forgot the winter he met a woman whose kindness eclipsed her fame. And in a small apartment filled with the scent of old paint and quiet devotion, the legacy of Marilyn Monroe lived on, not through photographs, not through films, not through fame, but through a single, handwritten message that had outlasted decades. A message that had once saved a man's life. A message she had left behind in a diner booth, believing in him more than he believed in himself. A message that ensured he never forgot his worth. And because of that, he never forgot her,